It didn't sound like a scream, more like something snapping, not just bone, not just tension, but something deeper, something invisible, something inside people. Mia Langston had only been in town for 48 hours. She was sipping a lukewarm chai and scrolling through job alerts when it happened. On the edge of her peripheral vision, she saw a man, frail and bundled in layers, being pressed to the pavement, not resisting, not yelling, just enduring. And she knew that sound, the sound of injustice pretending to be order. It didn't start with a fight. It started with a decision, a quiet, instinctive moment when someone saw wrong and chose not to walk away. Camille Rhodes had always believed in doing the right thing, not the easy thing, not the popular thing, the right thing. That belief had been stitched into her by years of late-night dinner-table debates, stories her father told in the soft gravel of his voice about justice, responsibility, and courage. Not everyone knew that her father was the state's attorney general, and she liked it that way. Camille never needed a title to do what was right. She needed conviction, she needed clarity, and on that winter afternoon, she had both. She was on her way back from a research interview downtown, clutching a leather satchel and a lukewarm thermos of tea. Her law professors praised her focus, her classmates envied her calm under pressure. But today, all of that would be tested. A commotion broke out near the corner of Ashford and 3rd, just outside the public library. Camille didn't think much of it at first. Sirens weren't rare in the city. But then she heard something else. A voice, raspy, tired, pleading. "I'm not doing anything, please. I didn't touch nobody." Camille paused, turning just in time to see a man, maybe in his late 50s, slumped against a storefront window. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He had an old coat buttoned crookedly and a bag of recyclables at his side. An officer, tall and red-faced, was gripping the man by the arm, trying to wrestle him to the ground. "Sir, just stay still." The officer barked. The man raised his hands slowly, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything. I was just sitting down." People walked past. Some looked, most didn single quotes. Camille didn't move. Not at first. She had been taught to observe before reacting. But then the man was forced down, knees hitting pavement, one arm twisted behind his back. Camille stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, officer, he doesn't look like he's resisting." The officer didn't look at her. He had already radioed something in, his grip tightening. "I said, he's not resisting," she said again, louder this time. Still no response. Just the sound of boots scuffing the sidewalk. The scrape of struggle that wasn't a struggle at all. That was when Camille did it. Not impulsively, not aggressively, just enough. She reached forward and tapped the officer's shoulder. "Please," she said, "you're hurting him." It all happened in seconds. The officer turned sharply and seized her wrist. "Ma'am, step back now. I didn't touch you," interfered with a lawful procedure. "That's obstruction." Camille's eyes widened, but her voice didn't shake. "I was trying to help." The handcuffs felt colder than she expected. Not painful, just jarring, shocking in their finality. People were filming now, phones raised, eyes wide, but no one stepped in. No one said her name. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood still as the cuffs clicked closed behind her back. In that moment, Camille could have told them who she was, could have spoken her name in full. Camille Jordan Rhodes, daughter of Marcus Rhodes, the longest-serving attorney general in the state's history. She could have dropped the weight of her father's title like a shield, but she didn't, because Camille believed in the system, or at least what it was supposed to be. And if the system couldn't tell the difference between a threat and a citizen asking for compassion, then maybe the system needed to see itself clearly. At the station, no one asked her side. Her fingerprints were taken. A cold bench waited. She stared ahead, still quiet, still thinking. A part of her was stunned. Another part was steady. By the time they brought her to booking, her tea was long cold. Her bag had been placed in a plastic bin, and still, no one had asked for her name. The officer behind the counter finally looked up. "Emergency contact." Camille met his eyes. "No one." He hesitated. "You sure?" She nodded. They wrote, "Refused to provide contact." That night, she sat in the holding cell, her coat bunched behind her, her breath clouding faintly in the air. The metal bench beneath her was cold. She could hear the hum of flickering lights. Above, the murmur of keys down the hall. Somewhere across town, her father was probably reading case files or sipping a cup of strong coffee, unaware that his daughter was sitting behind a locked door for trying to help a stranger. And yet, Camille didn't feel afraid. She felt something else: resolve. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed like a hive before the Queen enters. Reporters waited by the double doors, sniffing out a story before it had a name. No one knew who she was, just that she had interfered, just that a woman had stepped out of line. Camille stepped into the courtroom with her head high, her hands steady. She wore no makeup, no smile, no defense in her eyes, only the quiet steel of someone who knows they didn't do wrong. And then the judge entered. White, mid-60s, imposing in the way old institutions often are. Judge Warren Sloan, known for no-nonsense rulings, known for cutting words sharper than any gavel, known for being a gatekeeper, not a guide. He read the charge aloud, voice crisp and dry. Camille Rhodes, charged with obstruction and interfering with a peace officer. There was a pause. He finally looked up from the file and straight into her eyes. "Do you understand the charges against you?" "I do," she answered evenly. "And how do you plead?" "Not guilty." A flicker, that was all. A twitch of his jaw, the kind of expression that said, "Another one who thinks she knows better." The prosecutor, polished man in a grey suit and designer shoes, rose and began with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of escalation by the defendant. She involved herself in an ongoing arrest. She ignored verbal commands. She made physical contact with a law enforcement officer. Regardless of her intentions, her actions interfered with due process. The officer in question was acting within his rights, and her behavior, while perhaps emotionally driven, was legally unjustified." Camille didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "Intent matters," the prosecutor said smoothly. And the intent was obstruction. No one in the room knew her name beyond what was printed on the file. No one knew what she stood for, who she came from, what she had given up by saying nothing. But Camille knew. She knew what it meant to live your values, not wear them like ornaments, but carry them through the fire. And as the judge stared her down, measuring her like a page in a book already written, she sat still, waiting, watching, knowing that sometimes silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Because when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just clear her name, it would expose the cracks beneath the system itself. And the real question wouldn't be why she stayed silent. It would be, why did they never ask who she was in the first place? The morning after her arraignment, Camille sat in the small visitor room of the courthouse, staring out through the frosted glass window, watching the sunlight crawl across the city like it was waking up slower than usual. Her attorney hadn't arrived yet, and she didn't mind. Silence gave her space to think, and right now, she needed every second of it. Her mind kept replaying the moment, the man on the sidewalk, the officer's grip, the sound of metal tightening around her wrists. She hadn't touched him to hurt him. She had barely touched him at all. But to some, especially in power, perception outweighed truth. That's what made the courtroom dangerous. It wasn't the gavel. It wasn't the cold floor or the quiet whispers from the back rows. It was the way truth could be twisted without ever breaking a sweat. Camille knew all of that. She had watched her father try to reform the system from the inside for years, trying to fix what many had already given up on. But the system didn't always want fixing. Sometimes, it only wanted obedience. When her attorney finally walked in, he was younger than she expected. Nervous smile, a jacket that didn't quite fit, papers sliding out of a folder. He introduced himself as Leo Hart Camille Rhodes. He asked. She nodded. "Yes, I read the report," he said, flipping through pages. "They've painted a very tight picture. The officer's statement is detailed. The prosecutor's strategy seems to hinge on obstruction, not intent." She stayed quiet. Leo looked up, slightly uncertain. "You haven't said much." "I need to know. Did you say anything when it happened? Did you tell them who you are?" Camille shook her head. "No. You know that could change everything, right? I mean, the moment they realize who your father is." "I don't want that," she interrupted, calm but firm. "This isn't about my father. It's about what happened." Leo exhaled slowly. "I get that. I do. But the courtroom doesn't always care about ideals. It cares about strategy." Camille didn't answer, because she knew he was right, and also because she had a different strategy. It wasn't long before her second appearance in court arrived. This time, the gallery had filled, not because of her name still hidden from public view, but Because the video had made it online. The boy who filmed everything had uploaded it. Silently, anonymously. No caption, just a clip. 32 seconds long. No commentary, just truth. By the next morning, it had over 500,000 views. And now, the story wasn't just a courtroom document, it was a conversation. People were starting to ask questions. Not everyone, but enough. The kind of people who watched quietly and wondered if it could happen to their daughter, their sister, their friend. As Camille entered the courtroom, the energy was different. There was tension now, not hostility, just attention. Real, active attention. She felt it brush against her as she took her seat again beside Leo, who looked both energized and slightly overwhelmed. The judge may address the video today, he whispered to her. We don't know how he'll spin it. Be ready. She was. Judge Sloan entered, his robe crisp, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at the papers in front of him, then back at Camille. Miss Rhodes, he said, it has come to the court's attention that a recording of the incident has surfaced online. Camille met his eyes, steady. Yes, Your Honor. Are you aware of its contents? I am. Did you authorize the release? No. Do you believe it accurately represents what occurred? A long pause. Every breath in the room seemed to hold itself hostage. I believe it speaks for itself, she said. The judge narrowed his eyes slightly, but said nothing for a moment. Then, in a shift so subtle it could have been missed, he moved the file to one side and leaned back. I will allow the video to be entered as supplemental evidence for consideration at this time. Leo nearly dropped his pen. Camille didn't move, but something inside her clicked into place. The video was out. The truth was breathing. After court adjourned for the day, Camille stepped into the hallway and was immediately met with two things: a crowd of cameras, and a woman with a silver badge pinned to her lapel, who stood just far enough away not to be mistaken for security. The woman smiled lightly. Miss Rhodes, I'm with the Civil Rights Coalition. We've seen the footage. Camille raised an eyebrow. You're being watched, the woman said. Not as a threat, but as a promise. That's a good thing. Camille nodded. Thank you. But as she walked away, something else tugged at her memory. The night before all of this happened, she and her father had sat across from each other in their kitchen. He had looked tired, as he always did lately, but proud. They had been discussing a recent case he had fought for, an innocent man who had been wrongly incarcerated for nearly 15 years. Camille had asked him, how do you keep doing this? Doesn't it wear you down? And her father had replied, justice doesn't wear you down, Camille. The silence does. That's why you speak even when they don't listen. Especially then. She hadn't spoken his name since she was arrested. She hadn't even called him. Because this wasn't his battle to fight. It was hers. And yet, somewhere deep in her gut, she knew the moment was coming. The one where his name would be forced into the light. Not because she wanted it, but because someone else would use it. That night, Camille sat by the window in her apartment, released on her own recognizance. Sand watched the city lights blink through the trees. The video had changed everything, but it had also drawn attention from people who didn't want change, from voices that preferred the silence. She knew they were watching now, reading her file, scraping her history, looking for something to twist, and she knew the prosecutor would try to use it first, not to protect the law, but to preserve the illusion that it had never failed. Camille stared at her reflection in the glass, not afraid, just aware. And she whispered to herself, let them come. I'm not here to hide. She wasn't the Attorney General's daughter by name. She was his daughter by fire. And tomorrow, they would learn what that meant. Asterisk. The next morning, the sun cut through the courtroom. Windows like it had a purpose. Camille sat a little straighter in her chair. Something about the day felt heavier, more intentional, as if the ground beneath her had shifted ever so slightly while the city slept. She wasn't imagining it. She had felt it from the moment she woke. Her name now traveled further than she had intended. The story was no longer just in the room. It was in the headlines, on feeds, in whispers passed over cubicles and bus stops. Young woman interferes in arrest, or protects her life. The language changed depending on the outlet, depending on the bias, but one word was starting to find its way into the conversation: truth. Camille had spent the night reading every comment she could stomach. Some were kind, others burned, but none of them scared her, because buried among the noise were voices she recognized, not their names, but their tone, the people who had lived what she lived, people who didn't need an explanation to understand. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. That day, the courtroom wasn't just full, it was alive. Reporters sat poised. Law students filled the benches. A retired judge was seen sitting quietly in the back row, his expression unreadable. Even the bailiff seemed more alert than usual. When Judge Sloan entered, the room didn't fall silent. It held its breath. "All parties present?" he asked, his voice as crisp as ever. "Yes, Your Honor," both attorneys replied. Camille glanced at Leo. He gave her a subtle nod. He had been up all night preparing, diving deeper into case law, pulling precedents, outlining cross-examinations. But even with all that, he understood something Camille had known from the start: this trial would not be one on technicality. It would be one on character. Double quotes. "Mr. Holland," Judge Sloan said to the prosecutor, "I understand you intend to call your first witness today." Jason Holland stood slowly. There was confidence in the way he moved, measured, polished, deliberate. A man used to being the smartest in the room. He turned toward the gallery for a half-second before facing the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Officer Gregory Renner to the stand." A quiet stir passed through the benches, not because the name was famous but because it wasn't. The officer from the arrest. This was someone new, unexpected. Renner entered through the side door, wearing his uniform crisp and perfectly fitted. A few stripes marked his years of service. His demeanor suggested someone used to protocol, and someone deeply loyal to the system that trained him. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat. Holland began smoothly. "Officer Renner, were you present during the arrest of Mr. Denzel Reed and the subsequent detainment of the defendant, Camille Rhodes?" "No, sir," Renner replied. "I arrived 2 minutes after backup was called." Holland nodded. "But you were one of the first officers to review the body cam footage of Officer Clark, the arresting officer. Is that correct?" "I was." "Can you describe what you saw?" Renner's answer was rehearsed. "I saw a civilian, Miss Rhodes, interfere in an active arrest. She approached the officer, made physical contact. The situation escalated. Officer Clark responded according to protocol." Camille kept her eyes forward. She expected this. What mattered wasn't what Renner said, but how he said it. There was something cautious in his words, a hint of doubt he didn't quite conceal. Leo leaned closer. "He doesn't believe everything he's saying," he whispered. Camille replied, under her breath, "Then use it." When Leo stood for cross-examination, his voice was calm but pointed. "Officer Renner, how many body cam reviews have you conducted in your career?" "Dozens." "And in your opinion, is every arrest handled exactly by the book?" Renner hesitated. "Most are, but not all." A pause. "No, not all." Leo nodded. "Now, when you reviewed Officer Clark's footage, did you notice any signs that the suspect, Mr. Reed, was resisting arrest?" Another pause. Longer this time. Renner shifted in his seat. He was on the ground. His hands were behind his back. He didn't appear to be actively resisting. Leo took a step closer. "Did you observe any moment in the footage where Miss Rhodes physically attacked Officer Clark?" "No," Renner said. "She reached toward him. That's all. But no shove, no hit, no strike. Just an open hand reaching out." Renner's jaw tightened. "Correct." Leo let the silence hang for a moment before stepping back. No further questions. Renner stepped down, and in that small moment, barely noticeable to the average observer, Camille felt the courtroom lean ever so slightly in her direction. But the real shift came next. Jason Holland stood again, buttoned his jacket, and cleared his throat. "The prosecution calls its second witness, Officer Clark, the arresting officer, the man whose word had shaped the initial report, the charges, and the story that nearly cost Camille her name." He entered with a slow, controlled gait, the kind that came from years of training and zero doubt in his own authority. His face was clean-shaven, his eyes sharp. He nodded toward the judge before taking the oath and sitting down. Jason Holland didn't waste time. "Officer Clark, can you describe what happened on the morning of the arrest?" Clark didn't blink. "The suspect, Denzel Reed, refused to comply. I used appropriate force to restrain him. During that process, a civilian approached me, interfered physically. I assessed the contact as a threat and proceeded to detain her." "And did she say anything during that encounter?" "She shouted that I was hurting the suspect. I gave a verbal warning. She ignored it." "And in your opinion, did you follow proper user force protocols?" "I did." Camille felt the weight of his words press against her like a cold front. controlled, calculated, coated in policy. But then, Leo stood again, and he did something unexpected. He didn't ask a question. He played the video. The 32 seconds, no introduction, no narration. Just the clip, the raw, uncut moment, projected on a screen behind the witness stand. The sound echoed through the room. Camille's voice, Denzel's cry, the officer's silence, the click of cuffs. Don Juan breathed. And when it ended, Leo turned to Officer Clark. "Is that your definition of appropriate force?" Clark's jaw tensed. "Is that your definition of a threat?" Leo pressed. Clark didn't answer. The judge cleared his throat. "Answer the question, officer." Clark shifted in his seat. It was a tense situation. "But is that what you saw, threat?" "I made a call in the moment." Leo didn't blink. "Not a mistake." Clark didn't speak. Leo looked at the jury. No further questions. And that was it. Camille knew then it wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. The truth wasn't just in the footage. It was in the hesitation. It was in the silence that followed. It was in every eye in the courtroom beginning to see her not as a headline, or a defendant, or a warning, but as a person. One who stood up and refused to stay silent, even when the system tried to write her story for her. For the first time since the trial began, Camille's heartbeat slowed. Not because she was relaxed, not because she felt safe, but because something had shifted, and everyone in that courtroom felt it. What had once seemed like a simple case of obstruction had started to peel open, layer by layer, revealing questions no one expected to ask in public. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, small at first, just a few curious locals who had read about the trial in the morning paper. But as the hours passed, more arrived, students, advocates, quiet observers holding signs that didn't shout, but spoke with quiet strength. "Listen to her. Truth doesn't need a badge. Justice starts with courage." Camille had no idea they would come. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't even told many people what was happening. But somehow, her story was no longer just her own. Inside the courtroom, Judge Sloan recessed for lunch, but no one left quickly. Reporters gathered at the back, whispering to editors on their phones. One by one, even courtroom staff stole glances at Camille, not with suspicion now, but with something closer to respect. In the quiet hallway outside, Camille sat alone on a wooden bench, sipping from a bottle of water she hadn't realized she needed. Her hands still trembled, but it wasn't from fear. It was the weight of momentum, the feeling of a wheel beginning to turn. Slowly, but undeniably, she looked up when Leo sat beside her. He didn't say anything right away, just rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the tile floor. "Think it landed?" she asked. Leo nodded. "It didn't just land, it echoed." Camille breathed out a laugh, soft and tired. "You know, I thought if I just kept my head down, I could stay invisible. I didn't want anyone to know who I was." Leo turned toward her. "Camille, I need to ask something." "Okay." He hesitated. "Why didn't you tell anyone before? That your mother is the Attorney General?" Camille's throat tightened. There it was, the truth she had carried like a brick in her chest for weeks. "I didn't want it to change how they saw me," she said. "The prosecutor, the judge, even you." Leo didn't speak. He let the moment breathe. "I wanted to be seen as a citizen who did the right thing. Not a headline, not a legacy, just someone who couldn't walk past a man being hurt." Leo finally spoke. "Camille, that makes you more powerful, not less." She met his eyes. "Do you think it matters now that they know?" "I think it's going to matter a lot more very soon." That afternoon, the courtroom buzzed with the electricity of expectation. The state called its next witnessee, forensics analyst, who reviewed the footage for tampering. Their testimony was short, clinical, uneventful. Nothing was edited, nothing was distorted. The clip was real, and that made it undeniable. But the real turning point wasn't a witness, it was emotion. Leo stood before the judge, crisp and certain. "Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests to call a surprise witness to rebut the state's testimony, Mr. Denzel Reed." A murmur rippled across the courtroom. The judge raised his brow. "Mr. Reed has been absent since the incident. Does the court have confirmation he is present?" Leo turned toward the doors, and there he was, Denzel Reed, older than he looked in the footage, shoulders slightly stooped, jacket fraying at the sleeves, but his eyes steady, focused. He walked with purpose to the witness stand, a hush settling as he raised his right hand and took the oath. Every camera leaned forward, Every pen hovered above the page. Leo began gently. Mr. Reed, thank you for joining us. Can you tell the court what happened that morning from your perspective? Denzel cleared his throat. His voice was scratchy, but strong. I was cold. I was tired. I'd been sleeping near the station for a few days. I didn't do anything that morning except sit too long on a bench. Were you resisting arrest? No, sir. I didn't even understand why I was being arrested. Did you know Camille Rhodes? No. Never met her before. What happened when she approached the officer? She tried to speak up for me. That's all. She said I wasn't doing anything wrong. Tried to calm him down. She didn't hit anyone. She didn't yell. Did she hurt you? No, Denzel said, eyes locking with Camille's across the courtroom. She tried to protect me. Leo nodded, his voice softening. Why did you come here today? Denzel paused, swallowing hard. Because people like her, they don't usually get someone like me to speak up for them. But she did the right thing, and it's about time someone said that out loud. You could feel the silence in the room stretch and bend under the weight of his words. The prosecution had no questions. Camille exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. After court adjourned for the day, Camille stepped outside into the dusk, where the air had cooled and the sky burned with gold. The crowd had grown. She walked slowly, trying to absorb it all, the shifting tide, the softened glances, the hope threading through the city like light through leaves. One girl, no older than 10, stood near the courthouse steps holding her mother's hand. When Camille passed, the girl whispered something and pointed. The mother nodded. That the girl stepped forward. Are you the lady who told the truth? Camille knelt, so their eyes met. Yes, she said. I tried. The girl smiled, then looked back at her mother and nodded like she'd just seen a hero. Camille rose to her feet. Tomorrow would come, and with it, more questions, more pressure, maybe even more attempts to twist her story. But one thing was certain now. The world had started listening. It was the kind of morning that didn't feel like morning at all. Grey light pressed in through the courtroom windows, not quite bright enough to feel like day, not quiet enough to feel like night. Camille stood outside the courthouse door for a moment before walking in, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She had never believed in omens, but today felt different. There was no avoiding it anymore. Today, the prosecution would try to reclaim the narrative, and they were going to do it with precision. Inside the courtroom, the energy had shifted again. There was no yelling, no grand entrances, just the quiet tension of people who knew they were about to witness something important, a sense that what happened in the next few hours would not only affect Camille's fate, but ripple outward far beyond this courtroom. Leo stood at the defense table, reviewing his notes. He didn't say much to Camille. He didn't need to. The look they shared said enough. Stay grounded, stay sharp. Truth doesn't tremble. Across from them, the prosecutor, Ms. Kincaid, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for turning small wins into crushing victories, adjusted her blazer and stood to begin. She was calm, deliberate, a craftsman of doubt. Her voice didn't rise, but her words cut with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began. You've heard testimony that paints Ms. Rhodes as a hero, someone who stepped in out of compassion, whose actions were rooted in concern. But what you haven't heard is motive. Why was she at that exact location? Why did she involve herself in something she didn't witness from the beginning? Camille felt the weight of the courtroom's eyes shift again. Ms. Kincaid was shaping a new narrative. Word by word, she is not just a concerned citizen. She is the daughter of the state's Attorney General. And while that fact does not make her guilty, it raises an important question. Was this truly about justice, or was it about making a statement, about being seen? The words hung in the air, floating like fog. Leo stood, slow and steady. Objection. Speculative. Sustained. Judge Sloan ruled, his voice firm but neutral. Still, the seed had been planted, and Leo knew it. When court recessed for the afternoon, Camille didn't rush out. She lingered, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to understand what they were doing. The courtroom had become something larger than her, larger than Denzel, larger than the trial itself. It had become a mirror forcing people to look not just at what happened, but why it happened, and what they believed about it. On the courthouse steps, the crowd was still growing. Some came with signs, others just stood and listened. A group of college students read passages from civil rights cases into a megaphone, not to protest, but to remind people that justice was always about more than one verdict. Camille stepped into the hallway and found herself face to face with someone unexpected, Detective Mara Lin. She had testified briefly in the early days of the trial, a procedural formality, but now her presence felt pointed. "I thought you'd be in court," Camille said. "I was," Mara replied, "just not in uniform." There was a pause. "I saw the footage again," Mara said, eyes steady, "and I read the arrest report twice." Camille waited. "There are inconsistencies," she continued. "Descriptions that don't match the angles. Details about timing that don't hold." "You're not surprised, are you?" Camille asked softly. "No," Mara said, "but I wanted to be sure before I did anything." Camille's breath caught. "You're planning to come forward?" Mara looked over her shoulder, lowered her voice. "Not yet. But if this goes the way I think it will, I won't stay silent." For the first time in days, Camille felt something she hadn't let herself feel: hope. Not because someone promised her justice, but because someone was finally willing to take a risk for the truth. Later that evening, in a small conference room off the courthouse, Leo pulled out a thick file and dropped it gently on the table. Camille leaned over it. Inside were photos, transcripts, arrest reports, and disciplinary files. "Where did you get all this?" she asked. Leo's eyes gleamed with quiet fire. "It took some digging, but Officer Dan, the one who arrested you, has more than one excessive force complaint, most of them buried. One even went missing before a hearing." Camille flipped through the papers, each one telling a story the courtroom hadn't heard yet. "Can we use this?" Leo nodded. "I filed a motion to introduce a pattern of behavior. If the judge allows it, we change the game. But it's not a guarantee." "No," Leo said. "But if we stay quiet, they win by default." Camille stared at the documents, her thoughts spinning like threads on a loom. If the court saw the truth not just in her actions, but in the officers past, it wouldn't just clear her name. It might change how others saw the system altogether, a system that too often protected power and punished those who spoke out. That night, Camille didn't sleep. She lay on her side, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of a city, trying to hold its breath. Somewhere below, the streets whispered stories of their own, of protest, of courage, of wounds that hadn't yet healed. And Camille understood something new. Her silence had once been survival, but now her voice was resistance, and tomorrow she'd use it. The courtroom was more crowded than ever. The morning sun streamed through tall glass windows, making the polished wood floors glow like fire. People had arrived earlier, some 2 hours before the doors opened, just to get a seat. Students, elders, city workers on break, activists, curious strangers. Reporters lined the back wall like chess pieces in formation, recorders ready, pens poised. Something about today felt final, though no one could quite explain why. Camille stood just outside the heavy courtroom doors, her heart a low drum in her chest. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. She was something else now, sharper, grounded, like a page that had finally found its sentence. Leo joined her quietly. "You ready?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked at the brass plaque on the wall. "Justice is the constant and perpetual will to allot to every man his due." She smiled, not because it comforted her, but because it reminded her that justice didn't live in words. It lived in people brave enough to speak truth when silence was safer. "I'm ready," she finally said. Inside, the atmosphere shifted the second she entered. The quiet buzz softened into a hush, then vanished altogether. Even Judge Sloan paused when she walked in. It wasn't respected, was recognition. Camille wasn't a name on a docket anymore. She had become something more difficult to dismiss, a symbol of resistance wrapped in patience. Leo stood up. "Your Honor, we respectfully call Officer Thomas Dane back to the stand." A flicker passed over the prosecutor's face, not panic, but unease. Dane entered with a practiced walk, stoic, unreadable, but today, Camille noticed the tension in his jaw, the slightest hesitation in his step. He sat down, adjusted the mic, and folded his hands like a man trying to seem smaller than he was. "Officer Dane," Leo began, "you testified that Ms. Rhodes interfered with an arrest, used force against you, and created an unsafe situation. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And that arrest was for Denzel Moore?" "Correct, yes." Leo walked slowly to the evidence cart. "I want to revisit a few details. Officer Dane, how many use force reports have you filed in the last 2 years?" "Objection." Relevance. Judge. Sloane paused, then nodded. Overruled. Proceed. Dane shifted. 12. And how many of those were against unarmed individuals? 7. And how many of those individuals were black? There was a silence so thick it felt like gravity shifted. 5. Leo placed a single document in front of the jury. This is an internal affairs memo from 6 months ago. You were investigated for excessive force in a case involving a disabled veteran. That case was dropped. Why? No evidence, Dane said, eyes tight. Leo leaned in. Or no video evidence. Objection. Sustained. Leo backed off. Let's talk about that day. You claimed Ms. Rhodes made physical contact. But this footage, he gestured to the screen, shows her hand barely brushed your arm. Strike. No shove. Just an attempt to get your attention. I interpreted it as a threat. You interpreted it. Leo repeated, even though she said, you're hurting him. He's bleeding. Even though she didn't raise her voice, until you ignored her. I was focused on the suspect. Leo took a breath. Then, slowly, he pulled up a second video, the one recorded by the boy in the car across the street. Do you recognize this footage? Dane didn't answer. The screen showed Camille shouting, stepping forward, reaching out, but never pushing, never yelling, just standing in front of a man who couldn't stand for himself. The courtroom didn't move. No one blinked. Officer Dane, Leo said gently, does this video support your claim of a violent interference? Dane stared at the screen. No. There it was. Not an apology, not remorse, but a crack in the wall. Leo stepped back. No further questions. The prosecutor didn't bother with cross-examination. When Dane left the stand, the mood had changed. It wasn't celebration. It was something quieter, like watching a storm weaken, knowing the wreckage it left behind would take longer to clear. Then came Camille. She didn't need to take the stand. Leo warned her against it, but she stood anyway. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down without notes, without defense, just herself. She looked at the jury, not pleading, not proud, just present. I didn't step in because of who I am, she said. I stepped in because of who he was. A man, on the ground, in pain, being treated like something less. Her voice didn't shake. I know the law. I know the risks. But if someone asks me whether I'd do it again, knowing what would follow, the answer is still yes. She paused, because if we only act when it's safe, then nothing will ever change. The courtroom was silent. And then, it ended. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Camille waited in a room with no windows, watching the clock hands chase each other like tired dancers. When the verdict came, she stood, fingers clenched in front of her, bracing for anything. On the charge of obstruction, not guilty. On the charge of felony assault, not guilty. Camille exhaled, not because she'd won, but because she had made it through. Outside, a crowd waited. And when she stepped into the sunlight, they didn't cheer, they didn't chant, they simply stood, some with tears, some with fists over hearts, some holding hands. With strangers, it wasn't about the trial anymore. It was about the truth, the quiet, powerful kind that refuses to stay buried. And as Camille walked down the courthouse steps, not as the Attorney General's daughter, not as a defendant, but as herself, she knew something had shifted. Not the world, not yet, but enough to begin.